I never expected my life to change because of a phone call from a man I barely knew. My name is Noah Bennett. I'm 28 and I live on a small farm just outside Portland, Oregon. It's not the kind of place you see in movies. No sweeping plains, no cattle drives, no dramatic sunsets over endless fields. It's a modest operation, a few greenhouses, a repair shed, and a delivery route that keeps the local restaurants in fresh produce. I grow what I can, fix what breaks, and drive the old truck into the city 3 times a week. It's quiet work, honest work, the kind that lets me sleep at night without wondering who I had to step on to get there. The morning Richard Whitmore called, I was elbow deep in the irrigation pump behind the main greenhouse. The line had been acting up for weeks, and I didn't have the money to replace it yet. When my phone rang, I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me said to answer. "Mr. Bennett?" The voice on the other end said, smooth and practiced, like a man used to getting what he wanted. "This is Richard Whitmore. I believe you knew my late partner, Thomas Hale. He sold you the property a few years back." I remembered the name. Thomas had been fair when he sold me the land. We'd had a few business dinners, nothing more. I hadn't heard from anyone connected to him in years. "I need a favor," Richard continued. "My daughter, Avery, she's difficult. She's refused a marriage that would have secured her future and saved our family from significant financial trouble. I've decided she needs to learn what real work looks like. I want her to spend 3 months with you." I stood up slowly, wiping grease on my jeans. 3 months doing what exactly? Whatever you need. Manual labor. She's never done a hard day's work in her life. It's time she understood consequences. I didn't like the way he said it. Like she was a problem to be solved, not a person. But the pump was still leaking, and the bank had already sent 2 letters about the loan on the new greenhouse. Money was tight. "How much are we talking?" I asked. He named a number that made me pause. It would cover the pump, the back taxes, and still leave enough to breathe for a few months. "I'm not running a prison," I said. "If she wants to leave, I won't stop her." Richard chuckled, the sound cold. "She won't leave. She has nowhere else to go that doesn't involve marrying the man she's so determined to reject." He gave me the details. She would arrive the next afternoon. I hung up feeling uneasy, like I'd just agreed to something I didn't fully understand. The black SUV pulled up just after 3. I was stacking empty crates by the shed when the door opened and she stepped out. Avery Whitmore was 25, tall, and carried herself like someone who had never been told no in a way that mattered. Her coat was expensive, her boots were white, and her expression was carefully blank. A driver in a dark suit placed a single suitcase on the gravel and left without a word. I walked over, wiping my hands on a rag. "Noah Bennett," I said. "You must be Avery." She looked at me for a long moment like she was deciding whether I was worth speaking to. Then she nodded once. "My father said 3 months." Her voice was steady, but I caught the slight tremor underneath. Anger, maybe, or fear she was trying very hard to hide. "He did," I replied. "I told him if you want to go, the gate's right there. No one's locking you in." Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, I think. She hadn't expected that. "Why did you agree to take me?" she asked. I told her the truth. "Because I need the money to fix the irrigation system, but I'm not desperate enough to turn into your father's jailer." She didn't answer right away, just stood there with the suitcase at her feet, rain starting to dot her shoulders. For the first time, she looked at me like I was a person instead of an employee her father had hired. I showed her to the small room behind the kitchen. It wasn't much, just a bed, a desk, a dresser that had belonged to my grandmother, and a window that looked out over the greenhouses. No private bath, no fancy curtains. She didn't complain. She just set her suitcase down and stared at the bed like it might bite her. That evening, I was in the shed organizing tools when I heard her voice outside. She was on the phone, standing under the narrow overhang by the back door. The rain had picked up and her words carried across the quiet yard. "I'm not marrying him, Dad." I froze, wrench still in my hand. The voice on the other end was loud enough that I could hear the tone even from 20 feet away. Sharp, commanding, the kind of voice that expected obedience. Avery stood very still, shoulders tight, one hand gripping the railing like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "If the family goes bankrupt because I won't marry Grant, then we were already bankrupt long before this," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. I'm not a bargaining chip. She hung up without waiting for a reply. For a moment, she just stood there, head bowed, breathing hard. Then she turned and saw me watching. She didn't look embarrassed, just tired. You heard that, she said. It wasn't a question. Enough to know you didn't come here because you're spoiled or rebellious. Avery looked down at her hands. They were still shaking. I'd rather sleep in the barn than go back and marry that man. I didn't ask who Grant was. I didn't ask why her father was so determined. Instead, I walked over, opened the storage bench by the door, and pulled out an old work jacket. It was faded and patched in a few places, but it was warm. I held it out to her. 6 a.m. tomorrow, I said. If you're really staying, you work like everyone else. She took the jacket slowly. Her fingers brushed mine for half a second, cold, trembling, and then she nodded. For the first time since she arrived, the anger in her eyes softened into something else, something that looked almost like relief. I turned and walked back toward the shed, leaving her standing in the rain with my grandmother's jacket in her hands. I didn't look back, but I could feel her watching me the whole way. And for reasons I couldn't explain yet, I already knew this wasn't going to be the simple 3-month arrangement Richard Whitmore had described. The first week with Avery was harder than I expected. Not because she was difficult or rude, she wasn't. She was quiet, careful, and clearly trying. But it was obvious she had never done physical work in her life. On the first morning, she showed up at 6 sharp wearing the jacket I'd given her the night before. It was too big on her shoulders, the sleeves rolled twice at the cuffs. She didn't complain about the cold or the mud. She just stood there waiting for instructions, hands shoved deep in the pockets like she was afraid to touch anything. I started her with the easiest job I could think of, harvesting cherry tomatoes in the big greenhouse. I showed her how to twist them gently off the vine so the plant wouldn't tear, how to check for ripeness by color and feel. She nodded, said she understood, and got to work. By 9 o'clock, she had already dropped 2 full trays. The tomatoes rolled across the concrete floor like red marbles. She stared at the mess, face pale, and for a second, I thought she might cry. Instead, she crouched down and started picking them up one by one, wiping each one carefully on her jeans before placing it back in the tray. I'll do it again, she said quietly. Just show me slower this time. I did, and she watched like her life depended on it. By the end of that first day, her hands were covered in small cuts from the raspberry canes, her white sneakers were caked in dirt, and she moved like every muscle in her body was screaming. She didn't ask to stop early. When I told her she could rest, she shook her head and went back to the greenhouse to finish stacking the empty trays. That night, I found her sitting on the back steps, staring at her palms under the porch light. They were red and blistered. My father would love this, she said without looking up. He always said I needed to understand what it felt like to be brought down. I sat down a few feet away, drinking water from a plastic bottle. Work doesn't bring people down, I answered. The way people use work to humiliate others does. She turned her head and looked at me for a long time. It was the first time I saw something other than anger or exhaustion in her eyes. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the beginning of trust. The days after that, something shifted. She still struggled, but she stopped fighting the work. She started asking questions, real ones. How often did I check the soil pH? Which restaurants paid on time and which ones tried to haggle? Why did I grow certain varieties instead of others? She took notes on her phone like she was studying for an exam. Every evening, she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, reorganizing the order spreadsheet I had been managing by hand for years. One afternoon, a chef from a new restaurant in Portland called, furious because his arugula order was short. I was under the truck fixing the exhaust and couldn't get to the phone fast enough. Avery answered it. I heard her voice through the open window, calm, professional, apologetic without groveling. She checked the inventory, found the mistake in my handwriting, added the missing cases herself, and asked if I could drive her into the city to deliver them personally. On the way back, she sat in the passenger seat with dirt on her cheek and her hair tied back in a messy knot. She looked out the window at the passing fields and said, almost to herself, I thought I was only good at things that didn't matter. Parties, emails, smiling at investors. I kept my eyes on the road. Knowing how to talk to difficult people isn't useless. Around here, I need that skill more than I need someone who can plant straight rows. She laughed then, a small surprise sound I hadn't heard from her before. It was the first time she sounded like a real person instead of someone performing a role. By the end of the second week, she was doing things I had never asked her to do. She redesigned the simple website I used for wholesale orders, made it actually look professional. She took better photos of the produce with her phone and wrote short descriptions that made the vegetables sound like something worth paying extra for. When I asked why, she just shrugged and said, "Because if we're going to do this, we might as well do it right." I didn't correct her when she said we. Then Grant Caldwell showed up. It was a Thursday evening, already getting dark. I was loading crates into the back of the truck when a sleek black car I didn't recognize pulled into the yard. The man who stepped out looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not a farm. Expensive coat, polished shoes, the kind of watch that cost more than my entire irrigation system. He scanned the property like it offended him. Avery came out of the greenhouse still wearing gloves and the faded work jacket. Her hair was messy, her face flushed from the heat inside. She stopped when she saw him. "Grant," she said. Her voice was flat. "You shouldn't be here." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Your father wants you home, Avery. He's been patient long enough." I set the crate down slowly and stayed where I was. I wanted to see how she would handle this. Part of me already knew I wouldn't like the answer. Grant looked her up and down, taking in the dirt on her clothes, the calluses starting to form on her hands. "Is this your idea of proving something? That you can pretend to be poor for a few months?" Avery pulled off her gloves. Her hands were shaking, but her voice stayed steady. "You need to leave." He took a step closer. "Your father and I have an agreement. You're being dramatic. Come home and we'll forget this little rebellion ever happened." That was when I moved. I didn't raise my voice. I just walked over and stopped a few feet away, close enough that Grant had to acknowledge me. "She told you to leave," I said. He turned, finally noticing I existed. "And who the hell are you?" "The man who owns the ground you're standing on." Grant laughed once, short and ugly. Then he looked back at Avery. "You can play at being independent for another few weeks if it makes you feel better, but we both know how this ends. People like you don't survive without the family name holding you up." He got back in his car and drove away. Avery stayed in the middle of the yard for a long time after the taillights disappeared. I didn't go to her, I just waited. That night she sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea that had gone cold. She hadn't touched it. "Maybe he's right," she said quietly. "I don't know where I'd go if I didn't go back." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You're here." 3 months, she reminded me. 3 months is your father's deadline, I said. "Not yours." She looked up at me then, really looked, like she was seeing something she hadn't noticed before. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator. Outside, rain started tapping against the windows. For the first time since she arrived, Avery didn't argue. She just sat there, holding my gaze, and I saw something shift behind her eyes, something that looked dangerously close to hope. I turned away before I said anything else I couldn't take back. But I already knew the truth. This wasn't going to stay simple, not anymore. The end of the second month looked nothing like the beginning. Avery had changed in ways that had nothing to do with clothes or makeup. Her hands were no longer soft. Small cuts and calluses marked her palms. Her hair was usually pulled back in a quick knot, and there was almost always a smudge of dirt somewhere on her face or arms. The expensive coat she arrived in had been replaced by one of my old flannel shirts she'd claimed without asking. She looked real. Not like the polished version of herself that had stepped out of that black SUV, but like someone who had finally stopped performing. I noticed it most in the small moments. Every morning I made coffee and she sat at the kitchen table checking orders on her laptop, feet tucked under her like she belonged there. At lunch we ate sandwiches on the old wooden crates behind the greenhouse, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence while the sun warmed our backs. In the evenings, she worked on the website while I fixed whatever machine had decided to break that day. She would occasionally glance up, catch me watching her, and smile. Just a small, private smile that never failed to make my chest feel tighter than it should. One night, it rained hard enough to knock out power to the greenhouse. I was halfway through checking the breaker box when I heard the back door open. Avery stepped out holding the big flashlight from the kitchen drawer, already wearing the work jacket. Go back inside, I told her. It's freezing out here. She shook her head. You keep telling me to learn, so let me learn. I didn't argue. We stood under the narrow roof overhang while I worked on the old wiring. She held the flashlight steady with both hands, the beam never wavering even when her arms started to shake from the cold. Rain soaked through my shirt and ran down my neck, but she didn't complain once. When the lights finally flickered back on inside the greenhouse, she let out a small breath of relief, like we had just accomplished something important. Afterward, we stood on the back porch watching the rain fall across the dark yard. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. Avery was quiet for a long time before she spoke. I used to think if I ever left my family, I wouldn't be anyone anymore. I looked over at her. Her profile was soft in the dim light from the kitchen window. And now? I asked. She was silent for several seconds. Now I think maybe I never really knew who I was in the first place. The words landed heavy between us. I wanted to say something that would make it better, but nothing felt right. So I just told her the truth. Then you can start figuring it out here. She turned to look at me. We were close, closer than we had ever been. I could see the faint freckles across her nose that the sun had brought out over the last 2 months. Her eyes searched mine, and for one suspended second, I thought about closing the distance, about kissing her right there under the rain and the porch light. But I didn't. Instead, I took a small step back. You should go inside. You're cold. Something flickered across her face. Disappointment, maybe, or understanding. She didn't push. She just nodded and went back into the house, leaving me standing alone with rain dripping from my hair and a weight in my chest I couldn't name. A few days later, we were driving back from a delivery in Portland. The city lights blurred through the rain on the windshield. Avery had been quiet most of the ride. Then, without looking at me, she said my name. Noah. I kept my hands on the wheel. Yeah? I don't like you because you're an escape from my family. I didn't speak. I just waited. She continued, voice steady but soft. I like you because when I'm with you, I don't feel like I have to perform. I don't have to be the good daughter from the Whitmore family. I don't have to be the bargaining chip that saves the company. I don't even have to pretend I'm okay. I can just be me. I pulled the truck over to the side of the road and put it in park. The rain drummed on the roof. I turned to face her. Are you sure you want to say that right now? She nodded. I've thought about it a lot. I exhaled slowly. I like you too, Avery, but I don't want you to choose me just because I'm the first person who's been decent to you in a long time. Her eyes were bright in the dark. Then don't decide for me. I've had too many people do that already. The words hit me harder than I expected. She was right. I had been trying to protect her, but sometimes protection could become another kind of control. I reached across the console and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but they curled around mine without hesitation. We didn't kiss. We just sat there in the truck, listening to the rain, letting the truth sit between us without rushing to turn it into something bigger. But from that night on, everything felt different, clearer. I stopped pretending she was just a temporary worker. She stopped pretending she didn't watch me when she thought I wasn't looking. Then Richard called. It was a Sunday morning. Avery had just finished making pancakes, something she'd started doing on weekends because she said the kitchen smelled too much like motor oil when I cooked. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen, went still, and answered. I could hear her father's voice even from across the room. Sharp? Demanding? 3 months were almost up. There was a family event in Seattle next weekend. Grant would be there. This was her final chance to make things right. If she didn't come back, he would cut off all financial support for her mother. The company would be handed over to creditors. Everything would collapse. Avery set the phone down on the counter after he hung up. Her face had gone pale. He's using my mother to force me, she said quietly. I didn't ask what she was going to do, I just waited. She looked at me for a long moment. I want to stop running, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to face him. Then I'll go with you. She shook her head immediately. No, if you show up, he'll turn you into the reason I was corrupted. He'll make it about you instead of about me. I hated the idea of her walking into that room alone. But I respected her too much to argue. The next morning, she packed a small bag. Before she got into the car that came to pick her up, she left a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table. I opened it after she was gone. Don't let anyone tell you that silence means I agreed. I stood in the empty kitchen holding that note and felt the house grow larger and colder around me. She had only been here 2.5 months, but the place already felt wrong without her in it. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my wallet. Whatever happened in Seattle, I already knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let her face it alone. Not if she needed me. The hotel ballroom in Seattle was everything the farm was not. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the low hum of expensive conversation. I had never been inside a place like this before. My boots still had traces of Oregon mud on them, and my white button-down shirt felt too plain under the lights. But none of that mattered when I saw her. Avery stood near the center of the room in a deep blue dress that probably cost more than my truck. Her hair was styled perfectly, her makeup flawless. She looked like the version of herself I had met on that first day. Polished, distant, untouchable. But I knew better now. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers kept brushing the side of her dress like she was checking for something solid to hold on to. Richard Whitmore was introducing her to a circle of guests like she had just returned from a pleasant vacation. My daughter has been taking some time to mature, he said with a polished smile. 3 months in the countryside has done wonders for her perspective. Grant Caldwell stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on the small of her back like he already owned the right. Avery didn't flinch, but I saw her jaw tighten. She had texted me 3 hours earlier with only 4 words. I need you. I had driven straight through the night without stopping. I stayed near the back of the room, half hidden behind a pillar. I wasn't here to make a scene. I was here because she had asked. The rest was up to her. Richard raised his glass. And now, I have some wonderful news to share with all of you. Avery stepped forward before he could finish. I have something to say. The entire room went quiet. Richard's smile froze in place, his eyes turning sharp. Avery looked out over the crowd, then directly at her father. I will not be marrying Grant Caldwell. A ripple of murmurs moved through the guests. Grant's hand dropped from her back. Richard's face darkened. Avery, he said, voice low and dangerous, this is not the time. This is exactly the time, she replied, loud enough for several people nearby to hear clearly. I'm tired of pretending this is a choice. It never was. Grant stepped closer, his expression carefully controlled but his eyes furious. You're emotional. We can talk about this privately. Avery turned to him. I've talked privately with you more times than I can count. Every time I told you no, you and my father decided I would change my mind if you just waited long enough. I'm done waiting. Richard moved in front of her, blocking her view of the room. If you walk out of this agreement, our family loses everything, the company, the properties. Your mother's security, is that what you want? Avery's hands were shaking, but her voice didn't waver. If the only way to save this family is to sell your daughter to a man she despises, then this family was already lost a long time ago. I saw Richard's hand twitch like he wanted to grab her wrist. That was when I stepped out from behind the pillar and walked forward. I didn't rush. I didn't shout. I simply made my way through the crowd until I was standing at the edge of their small circle. Richard spotted me first. His face twisted with recognition and disgust. You have no right to be here, he snapped. I'm not here to claim any rights, I answered calmly. I'm here because Avery asked me to come. Grant let out a short, bitter laugh. So, this is the reason? Some farmhand convinced you you're living in a romance novel? Avery looked at him without flinching. No, he's the first person who never tried to decide my life for me. Richard took a step toward her. If you leave with him, you are no longer my daughter. The words landed like a physical blow. Avery went very still. I saw the color drain from her face. For a second, I thought she might break right there in front of everyone. I moved closer, close enough that she could reach me if she wanted, but I didn't touch her. This had to be her choice. I spoke quietly, only for her. Avery, you don't have to answer him right now, but you can walk out of here if you want to. She turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes were glassy with tears she refused to let fall. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached out and took my hand. I want to go, she said. We walked out of that ballroom together while the entire room watched in stunned silence. No one clapped. No one cheered. Just the sound of our footsteps on marble and the low rush of whispered voices behind us. In the lobby, she finally let go. Her shoulders started shaking. I pulled her into my arms right there under the crystal chandelier, not caring who saw. She didn't cry loudly, just quiet, exhausted sobs against my chest. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," I said into her hair. "But you did it anyway." We didn't drive back to the farm that night. I found a small inn on the outskirts of the city, nothing fancy, just clean rooms and quiet. I got her a separate room so she could breathe. Around midnight, she knocked on my door, eyes swollen, wearing one of the inn's robes. She called her mother from my room. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to Avery's voice crack and steady again. When she finally hung up, she looked at me with something close to wonder. "She cried," Avery said softly, "and she told me she was proud of me. For the first time in my life." I didn't say anything. I just opened my arms and let her curl against my side. We didn't talk about what came next. We just sat there until the sky outside started to lighten. The next morning, she stepped out of her room wearing the same blue dress from the night before, now wrinkled, her hair loose and messy. She looked exhausted and lighter at the same time. "I don't have a home anymore," she said. I reached for her hand. "Then we'll build a new one. It doesn't have to be a place. It can start with a choice." She squeezed my fingers. For the first time since I had known her, Avery Whitmore looked like someone who finally believed she was allowed to choose, and I already knew I would follow her anywhere she decided to go. Avery came back to the farm on a Tuesday morning in the late autumn. The same black car that had dropped her off 3 months earlier pulled into the yard again, but this time she stepped out before the driver could open her door. She was wearing the faded flannel shirt she had stolen from my closet weeks ago, her hair loose and wind-tangled from the drive. She carried only one small bag. When she looked up and saw me standing by the greenhouse, she smiled. Not the careful, guarded smile she had worn on the first day, but something real and tired and relieved. She wasn't returning as a punishment anymore. She was choosing to come home. Richard had followed through on his threats. The money stopped. Grant Caldwell quietly withdrew from the deal once the story of Avery's public refusal hit the Seattle papers. The Whitmore family's financial troubles became public knowledge within days. But instead of breaking, Avery threw herself into the farm with a focus I had never seen before. She rebuilt the wholesale ordering system from scratch, contacted every restaurant we had ever worked with, and started offering weekend tours of the greenhouses for city families who wanted their kids to see where food actually came from. She even began teaching small classes on growing vegetables in winter. Within 6 months, the farm's revenue had doubled. I was finally able to replace the old irrigation system without touching a single dollar of Richard Whitmore's money. She refused to let me support her. "I'm not here to be taken care of," she told me one night while we were cleaning the packing shed. "I want my own pay, my own projects, my own name on the things I build." I didn't argue. I just nodded and handed her the ledger so she could start tracking her own hours. Our relationship grew the same way the farm did, slowly, steadily, without fanfare. Some nights, she still got quiet after reading articles about her family's downfall. Sometimes she wondered out loud if she had been selfish. I never tried to fix those moments. I just sat beside her on the old couch, our shoulders touching, and waited until she found her own way back to steady ground. A year after she returned, her mother came to visit. Eleanor Whitmore arrived on a warm spring afternoon wearing a simple sundress and carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked along the driveway. She stood at the edge of the greenhouse for a long time, watching Avery explain crop rotation to a group of schoolchildren. When Avery finally noticed her, Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I've never seen you look more alive," she said later, when the two of them were sitting on the back porch with glasses of lemonade. "Your father always said this place would break you. He was wrong." Avery reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "He was wrong about a lot of things." Richard never visited, but 3 months later a letter arrived in the mailbox with his handwriting on the envelope. Avery read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer beside the bed. She didn't throw it away. She just wasn't ready to answer yet. The day I asked her to marry me, the leaves in the greenhouse had already started turning gold. It was late afternoon. The light slanted through the glass roof in long, warm stripes. Avery was sitting at the old wooden table where she had first redesigned our website, surrounded by seed catalogs and half-finished order forms. I walked over, wiped my hands on my jeans, and set a small wooden box in front of her. She looked up, curious. "I'm not asking because you need a place to stay," I said. "I'm asking because you finally chose your own life. And I want to be part of whatever comes next." Avery opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring I had bought from a jeweler in Portland the week before. Nothing flashy, just something that would look right on hands that knew how to work. She stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at me with eyes that were already shining. "You're sure?" she asked softly. "I come with a lot of complications." "I know," I answered, "but you also come with light. And I'm choosing both." She laughed through the tears and said yes. We got married on the farm the following October. No ballroom, no crystal chandeliers. Just the greenhouse strung with simple lights, rows of late tomatoes still hanging on the vines, and the people who had actually stood by her, her mother, a few loyal restaurant owners, the handful of workers who had become family over the past year. Avery wore a simple white dress and carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked from the edge of the property. When she walked toward me between the long tables of vegetables, I thought about the girl who had arrived in a black SUV with cold eyes and a suitcase full of armor. I thought about the night she told me she would rather sleep in the barn than marry Grant. I thought about the moment she took my hand in that Seattle ballroom and chose to walk away from everything she had ever known. And I realized something important. Richard Whitmore had sent his daughter here to learn how to bow her head. But this farm had never taught Avery to bow. It had given her a place to stand tall,